Hello there, my name is Kate and welcome to my channel. Trinergy Awakens Naturally. It's very natural. I was lying down, I'm in the midst of moving and I'm taking a rest break, and I was just lying here, and I guess the mind is not going to just sit down and lie down and rest also. So I thought I'd spit out this message right quick about perception and some of the assumptions that we make. This is just so cool. The other day, I work at a prison, I work at a federal prison with inmates who are in for some pretty violent stuff, and most of them are on a track to be rehabbing back out into society. They're looking to be released sometime within the next 2 days to 15 years, and that's all happening very quickly, randomly, etc. However, most of them are scrambling with at least 5 years as their target date to get out. So anyway, that having been said, this particular prison is in Florence, Colorado, and oh my gosh, there are gophers or something, some sort of little tunneling rodent that lives out there. I don't think it's a groundhog, because groundhogs are pretty big, if I remember correctly, but I believe it doesn't matter, gopher, let's just go with gopher. They're burrowing animals, and they are all over the place, and I was talking to the CEO when she was escorting me back to the lobby, that I said, what is it with the little burrowing animal? And she said, I know, crazy, right? And I said, if the gophers all get together, they could conspire with the inmates and break them out. You'd have a whole conspiracy on your hands and a whole prison break if the inmates ever decide to side with the gophers. And she laughed, and she was like, yeah, well, she goes, we actually have inmates that have made gophers their pets. And I'm thinking, seriously? My mind went like a jackrabbit in about 12 different directions, trying to figure out how do you lure a gopher into the yard, first of all, or do they just pop up in the middle and say, hey, as soon as you start speaking gopher, we're going to have a way out of here. But that was the first question I had, and then the second is I looked at her and I said, how do they make that work? And she said, oh, you'd be surprised. These guys find ways to, have pets. And I say, pets? You're already on to a gopher. How many more options do these guys have? They're in a pretty secure facility here. It takes a lot for me to get in, and then even more for them to get out. What the hell are you saying? So, I was tickled pink. The correctional officer was just kind of looking at me like, okay, easily entertained. Yeah, that's good. So, I said, what other kind of pets are available here that these guys are finding? And she said, oh, the tarantulas. Like, oh, yeah, that's right. The tarantula crawl happens about this time every year. Big old suckers, it's dudes, little male tarantulas looking for a mate, you know what I'm saying? And they're actually pretty docile, so that didn't surprise me. It was just a matter of, okay, nobody's noticing that we're bringing in a live animal with us whenever we come back from the yard. Okay. And then the other thing were like lizards, right? And I was like, okay. And she said she had seen dudes who had them resting on their shirt, And I said, okay, well, we've gotten through a few questions, but I got questions. I'm going to need to interview some more here. I'm like, are they allowed to have lizards on their shirts? You see this, and that's allowed, that if they've captured something, they're allowed to keep it. And she said, well, she goes, outside all of the offenses that could be happening, we sometimes just kind of turn a blind eye. And when we do a shakedown, obviously, if we find it in the cell, then we have to take it away from them. But sometimes COs just kind of overlook things, because in the grand scheme of what they could be doing, shanks and stuff that are found, they're not likely to, carve up a lizard and throw it at me or something. So I'm not too concerned. However, yes, there is a policy that they're not supposed to be keeping pets. But I was so blown away by this, and I said, okay, so next on the list is, how do these dudes act with these live animals? Because, excuse me, the fact that these men are in there for pretty severe crimes. Most of the guys I deal with are nonviolent in terms of the level of violence that is across the board available to have in the different security levels of the prison. They're in for mostly drug charges, and there's definitely violence associated with it. However, it's not ADX. It's not exactly that level where their offenses are related to the violence that they've perpetrated, offing folks routinely, etc. There are some. However, it's still more situational, which, again, I want to put it out there for anybody who's heard a video of mine or not. I'm not into the hug a thug thing. I'm into the rehab a thug so they don't go out and thug again. Let's not re-thug is what my angle is. And definitely hug the thug and everybody, when it's appropriate, and hold them accountable, when it's appropriate as well, whether they're in the state pen, the ADX, or, living with me in my home. I want to make sure I understand that. But back to, how do these guys handle their relationship with a live animal? And she said it's actually one of the reasons that we kind of overlook it when we can, excuse me, when it's just, not appropriate, and when we really can't overlook it anymore, of course we need to put our foot down. However, it's one of the reasons they are so desperate to take care of something, and then, oh my God, let me interview some more. I went completely Carl Jung. I'm on a whole psychological profile with how to psychologically profile somebody who's already been profiled. What? I said, how does that work? And she said, well, they really want to be able to take care of something. Those that do, and they take very serious care of them. And, to train a lizard, or to be safe enough for a wild lizard or a gopher. I guess gophers aren't that bright. These things, she says she has to kind of scoot them off the sidewalks with her foot. So, okay, maybe those aren't the ones that are most skittish. But to be able to train them, or to be so safe to a wild animal that it's willing to sit on your chest or ride around on your shoulder or stay in a pocket or something, or tarantula, gopher, whatever it is, that another live being, that's pretty profound. And in my mind, I'm thinking, these are guys that they don't like to get terribly squishy. In the classes that I teach, it can get pretty intense because it's a self-review. We're not in there touchy-feely about how we feel towards other people. This is a class of, how do you feel about you, so that you don't go out and do you again the way that you did before you got here, because there's something wrong with that formula. Let's look at the cake you made that brought you here and never do it that way again. What were those ingredients? And so there's not really a whole lot of, warm and squishy about how somebody feels regarding something outside of them. I do ask them about, do you have children, do you have family members, etc. And those are, can be difficult to assess, because we have convicts that have been, come from just gang families and stuff, that, not meaning to disparage anything, it's just violence was what they knew, and the way that love was expressed was, in a way that's pretty tough. And I don't mean even remotely healthy. That love and affection, were not one and the same. And, being able to express that, take that to another live thing that isn't human, is sometimes easier for these guys. And that's what the CEO is saying, is that they can't always express with their mouths, and I find that to be very true. They cannot always express with their mouths what their heart might actually want to be able to say, or can say, whenever it's placed into the affection or the interest or the connection, whatever it is, to another live creature. When that creature doesn't speak the same language, it doesn't speak human at all, it doesn't have any other connection available to it except the intention to just do no harm. And that is often very messed up, in families, particularly felons. They usually come from pretty tough backgrounds. And so, being able to know that they connect, some of them connect with other live beings, that they've found a way to open their heart to life, and be respectful of it. And I said, well, do you have anybody out there, I get questions on both sides of this, do you have anybody out there doing anything weird with animals? And she said, no. She said the people that, really are kind of scary in that direction, or would be, the animals don't go near them. And I thought, well, that makes sense, that the animal must sense some ability for whomever it is to take the time, because these guys got time, take the time to build a relationship, and there's a connection there. Then that's really cool. But it was so profound to me that I was drawn with, Making assumptions. I didn't think that I was making assumptions about these guys. However, that was a perfect example of a blind, excuse me, a blind assumption that I didn't even know I had, is that, they speak in their classes kind of guarded, and, they won't make eye contact and things like that, and they don't necessarily want to get into their emo bag, and I don't ask them to, if it gets a little bit too heated or too weird, inside them, and I see their eyeballs starting to spin, I back out because I'm not trying to trigger you, friend. However, the quiet assumption was that they would not be able to connect. If they can't connect about themselves, then they must not, 1010, they must not be able to connect. And boy, was that an ignorance on my part, that, being able to connect with something outside of themselves that's non-human is easier sometimes, and that made sense to me. I just didn't realize until, we were talking about it, because excuse me, it all got started with the fact that I was tickled with the gophers when I came in that morning. There were just gophers everywhere, and they're funny to watch. As I'm driving up to FCI, I laugh because they're just running around, they're playing, they're having a great time, and they're jovial little critters, And then one of the units that I work in actually has a dog program. They train dogs, and so there are particular inmates. I've not had any of them in my classes, but there's particular inmates that they have, their dog, and that's the dog that they're training to be service dogs. And so the same dogs, the same handler, inmate I see, and I've asked them whenever I'm on my way back out of this facility or into the facility, I always ask, hey, can I stop long enough to pet the dog? And COs are usually really good about that yes, it's a good opportunity for the inmate and the dog, handler and dog, to have somebody different than what they normally see, inside a prison is not exactly, the extent of what the service dog will do. However, these guys are very devoted, and they're allowed to keep them, 100% of the time. They're expected to keep them. These are in, a high-level unit that, these are guys that are going to be returning to the street within, a year or two. And so they're well behaved, and these animals are, well taken care of. But it's really cool to see those guys, and it never occurred to me what kind of ignorance that kind changed your perception immediately, Kate. That never occurred to me that there would be other guys in other parts of the facility that they're in there for worse crimes and they're not behaving as well, that they're over collecting lizards every chance they get to befriend them, because they need that connection with life. They need that connection with something that will validate them as being a sentient human being. Now, they probably wouldn't catalog it that way, but that's the way psychology tells me, is that we're seeking validation, appreciation, and connection, constantly. And psychology tells us that we need human connection. That's what I've heard all the time, is we need human connection, and we do. However, they got more human connection than they know what to do with there, and really their need to be felt and seen as a sentient being is had for some of them by reaching outside of themselves so far that they're willing to consider befriending a lizard or a gopher or a tarantula. I mean, that's pretty outside the box. And, the fact that she told me that they don't have a problem with, people tormenting or doing anything weird with these animals. They don't see them, like the people who would be doing something gross or weird with the animals. They don't see that. What they do see is a need to, we have a shakedown and I found your tarantula that I knew you had. We're not going to be able to let you keep that. So it just ran into a whole thing of what kind of perceptions are ignorant and blind in us sometimes, and some of the things that we don't even think about or process until somebody surprises us, if we can open our mind to that experience. But I'm so glad that I saw that, because I don't always see the softer side of guys, because we're talking about pretty intensive stuff when we're doing self-reflection in prison. There's a little bit more perhaps to process and self-reflect about than the average person maybe, and it's possibly got some more content than the average bear perhaps. And so it was nice to see a different side of that and to understand. And I actually saw one of the students from a class that I taught before, when we walked by on the sidewalk, he was rolling by with a cart, and I was like, oh hey, how you doing? And it was like, oh hi there, Miss Kay, how are you doing? And I'm like, that's the human connection, and that's really cool. well, he remembered my name and I remembered him. And the human connection can also convey into the natural world, and being able to appreciate that. It was really nice to see. So anyway, I'm going to continue my napping, my not napping, my lying here, forcing my body to rest because it's my proclivity to want to get up and do 12 things. However, it's not very wise. So I'm going to go and do my thing. But thank you. I hope that this is helpful for you in some way. And I hope that you enjoy your day no matter what part of the day you're in. Remember to get within your skin because you're divine. It can be fine and is fine and can be found in human connection and animal connection and fish connection and bird connection. It can be found outside of us externally through sentient life. So enjoy yourselves and have a great day, and I'll talk to you again soon. Mwah. Bye, friends.